If I'm being honest, I didn't expect a summer trip to Soyuz to turn into a debate over faith and God. It was supposed to be a laid-back getaway, just a close friend and I, with some wakeboarding, late-night bonfires, and heat that made you want to live in the lake. But somewhere between some marshmallows and a campfire, my friend and I ended up in an intense debate that left me thinking for months afterwards. We both came from sick families, but our beliefs were very different. He didn't believe in God at all, while I had always accepted the idea of a universal, formless God without much question. I liked my belief because I felt you couldn't disprove God's existence, making it a feasible possibility that aligned with my values. He argued that belief in God was just a comforting story people tell themselves to cope with the unknown, and that without evidence it couldn't be true. His confident skepticism made me pause and start questioning my own belief. I realized I had never seriously considered whether my belief was something I truly understood or just something I accepted because it was familiar. Looking at this from a philosophical lens, I'm going to start by comparing empiricism and rationalism. Let's start with empiricism. From an empiricist perspective, my belief in God wasn't based on real knowledge. It was something I'd accepted through culture, family, and tradition, not through personal experience. At least that's what my friend tried to argue. John Locke, a major empiricist, believed our minds are born as a tabula rasa, a blank slate, and that everything we know is written onto that slate through sense experience. So in the eyes of empiricism, I hadn't truly known God existed. I had simply absorbed that belief from my surroundings without ever testing it for myself. When my friend challenged me and said believing in God was like believing in Bigfoot or aliens, he was asking me to consider what evidence I actually had for my belief. This triggered my doubt. I realized that I had never seen, heard, or experienced anything that could prove God existed, at least not in a way that would satisfy someone asking for physical or observable proof. Empiricism relies on a posteriori knowledge, which means knowledge that comes after experience. According to this view, ideas only become reliable if they're grounded in observable facts or repeated experiences. So when I couldn't point to any concrete evidence, I was forced to ask myself if my belief counted as knowledge at all, and if my belief in God was something I really believed to be true. Empiricists also relied on inductive reasoning, where knowledge is built by recognizing patterns in sensory experience. For example, if you observe over and over that dropped objects fall, you infer the law of gravity. In my case, the pattern was more about absence. I had no experiences of God that would justify my belief. That made me question whether I should keep holding on to it, and overall question the validity of the belief. Locke would also use Occam's razor. Here, the principle that the simplest explanation is usually the best. My friend's argument that it makes more sense to not believe in something when there's no evidence would be supported by this theory. It avoids assuming something extra when we don't need to. So from this view, in God becomes a more complicated explanation than a necessary one, and doubt is the more rational conclusion unless clear evidence appears. Even though empiricism often leads to doubt, not all empiricists rejected belief in God. George Berkeley, for example, believed that everything we experience is only real because it is being perceived, either by us or by God. His famous phrase, "to be is to be perceived," means things exist because someone is aware of them, and when no human is watching, Berkeley argued that God is always perceiving everything, so the world still exists. So while Locke raised questions that made me doubt, Berkeley reminded me that belief in God could still make sense within an empiricist view, just in a different way. In short, empiricism would say my doubt was a direct result of confronting a belief that had no sensory support. That's specifically Locke's view. The moment I stepped outside of my inherited beliefs and started relying on experience and evidence, I would hit a wall, and that wall would cause me to question what I thought I actually knew, and what I thought was actually true. Now we're going to hop into rationalism. On the flip side, rationalism offers a totally different interpretation of that moment and that argument between me and my friend. For Rene Descartes and other rationalists, sense experience is completely unreliable. We can be tricked by illusions, dreams, and even our own perceptions. Because of that, rationalists argue that real knowledge has to come from reason, not from what we see or feel. Rationalists believe in a priori knowledge truths that exist before experience and that we can discover through logic and reasoning alone. Descartes even believed in innate ideas, such as the idea of God, which he said are planted in us by God himself. From this view, belief in God doesn't require sensory proof at all. It comes from the structure of our own rational mind. So when I responded to my friend by saying you can't prove God doesn't exist, I was actually showing a kind of rationalist reasoning. I was suggesting that some truths might lie beyond what the senses can test. Rationalism focuses on deductive reasoning, starting from logical self evident truths and reasoning from there. Descartes' famous statement, "I think, therefore I am," is a perfect example. He began by doubting everything, but couldn't doubt that he was thinking. From there, he rebuilt knowledge based on logic and certainty. In the same way, rationalism would see my moment of doubt not as a failure of belief, but as the beginning of deeper philosophical inquiry. Rationalists believe reason can take you further than your senses ever will. In this case, the idea that God might exist is still logically possible, even without evidence, and might even be necessary to explain certain aspects of reality, such as the existence of moral law or consciousness itself. So while empiricism pushed me to doubt because I lacked physical evidence, rationalism reminded me that some truths may not depend on the physical world at all. My belief then didn't have to be disproven by experience, it just had to make sense logically. And therefore, what I was arguing at the time still had a point and could still prove to be true. Now, on to the topic of skepticism. A skeptic, especially one influenced by the ideas of philosopher David Hume, would likely challenge almost every aspect of my belief in God. From his perspective, my faith, though personally meaningful, would raise serious epistemological concerns. Now, onto the question, what would a skeptic question about my beliefs or assumptions? A skeptic would start by questioning the foundation of my belief. How do I know it's true? They might say you believe in God because it makes sense to you and feels intuitively true, but how can you trust your feelings or intuition? They would likely argue that intuition is not evidence, and that what feels right is often shaped by culture, upbringing, and emotion, not objective truth. In my case, my sick faith, which I admitted I never questioned growing up, would be seen not as knowledge but as conditioning. A skeptic might ask, would I still believe in God if I were raised in a different country, by different parents, or in a different religion altogether? David Hume, for example, famously questioned the idea of causality, arguing that we never actually observe cause itself. We only see one event follow another and assume there's a necessary connection. Applying this to my belief, Hume would ask, just because you see complexity or beauty in nature, does that really prove the existence of a divine cause behind it? Or are you simply inferring a cause based on habit or emotion? A skeptic mindset would also insist that we must limit our claims to what can be directly observed. Since God is not something we can see, hear, or test, they would say my belief rests on faith, not knowledge, or even the truth. A skeptic would also argue that I have no epistemic justification for my belief in God. Hume, for instance, would likely say that claims that go beyond experience, such as miracles, God, or a universal spirit, require an amount of proof that religious belief simply does not meet. Because I cannot provide repeatable sensory based evidence of God's existence, a skeptic like Hume would say I have no grounds for treating my belief as knowledge, only as hope, comfort, or even tradition. Other skeptics would use Descartes' original rationale, which would push me to doubt everything I think I know until I arrive at a something certain. Even though Descartes himself chooses to believe in God to answer some unknowns, from his original theory he would say that until I can rebuild my beliefs from undeniable truths like my existence, I cannot truly know anything. Basically, some skeptics might say since God is an undeniable truth, I cannot truly know whether or not he is real and exists. In this case, skepticism can help influence my understanding of the truth because skepticism doesn't necessarily destroy my faith, it can even refine it. It helped me distinguish between beliefs I accepted blindly and those I now hold with deeper conviction. I may not be able to prove God exists in the way science proves gravity, but I also don't think that's the point. As Descartes showed, even certainty begins with doubt, and my doubts help me build a stronger foundation for what I believe to be true. Now moving on to the correspondence theory. The correspondence theory argues that something is only true if it matches a fact in the external world, so it would not automatically accept my experience of God as true just because it feels real to me. Instead, it would ask, does the claim God exists actually align with objective reality? Since the theory depends on what can be verified through the senses, personal faith or spiritual beings aren't enough. This makes me question whether my belief in God reflects an actual fact or just a deeply personal experience. To determine if my understanding corresponds to the external world, I need to find objective, observable evidence that supports God's existence, something that holds up outside of my own perspective. Without that, the theory would say my belief may be meaningful, but not necessarily true. It separates the truth from emotion, pushing me to look for facts, not just feelings, in order to know what's real. Coherence theory, on the other hand, suggests a belief is true if it fits consistently within a larger web of accepted beliefs. My belief in God connects with many of my other core beliefs, that all life has a soul, that we are meant to live with compassion and service, and that there is moral structure in the universe. These beliefs support one another and help make the existence of God more probable within my worldview. However, during a debate with my friend who doesn't believe in God, this coherence was challenged. From their perspective, my belief in God lacks empirical grounding and doesn't align with their system of logic and science-based beliefs. To them, my beliefs would be considered false and therefore incoherent. This reveals a weakness in coherence theory. Truth becomes relative to the belief system it sits in. If someone doesn't share my underlying beliefs, the coherence collapses in their eyes. However, I believe in God to be true, and my other beliefs do support this. So yes, from my perspective, it does prove to be true. Finally, pragmatic theory asks if a belief works by leading to positive practical outcomes. My belief in God motivates me to volunteer at places like Guru Nanak's Free Kitchen, where I serve others out of genuine kindness. This belief inspires actions that benefit both myself and my community, creating real positive changes. From a pragmatic view, because my belief leads to these good outcomes, it can be considered in practical sense true. William James would say that since my faith brings harmony and purpose to my life, it works and is justified. However, as Richard Rorty points out, truth also depends on social agreement. Different groups may have different standards for what counts as true. So while my belief in God is true for me because it produces meaningful results, others might not see it the same way. This shows pragmatism's relative nature. Truth is linked to usefulness, but may vary between people or communities. Finally, reflecting on my understanding of truth, reality, and knowledge, I find that rationalism aligns most closely with my belief in God. Since we cannot fully disprove the unknown, it is certainly possible that God exists, even if we can't prove it through direct evidence. Rationalism allows me to accept this possibility through reason alone, especially when sensory experience doesn't provide all the answers. However, I don't apply rationalism to every part of my life because doing so would sometimes lead to irrational outcomes. For example, if I went outside constantly thinking it's feasible that I might die in a car crash at any moment, I'd live in constant fear. While it's true that these things are possible, living like that wouldn't be practical or healthy. Over time, my reflection on truth and reality has evolved from expecting clear-cut answers to understanding that truth is often complex and multifaceted. I've learned that relying solely on one approach, whether it be rationalism, empiricism, or skepticism, limits how I fully grasp the world around me. This growth in perspective has helped me accept that some truths are experienced, some are reasoned, and others are tested through practical outcomes. It has made me more flexible and thoughtful about what I consider true and real in different parts of my life.